Beautiful. Okay, so welcome everybody to Short History of the World, our Friday journey through the human story on planet Earth. And I'd like to welcome Nicole, who is doing some notes straight out of her big brain right now, a big human brain. So just continue to write up there whatever pops into your mind as we explore this. Okay, Nicole? And then when you have to go, you have to go. All right? Good. So just be aware that you're going to be seeing notes coming up there on the board, maybe fast and furious, we will see. But we're going to follow our format today that has been really developing well, and that is I'm going to jump into a lecture very quickly to get us to noon, and then we're going to have our interaction. We're missing our high chairs for some reason, so whoever comes up here will have to stand, and that way you'll get a little exercise. Other than that, I'd like to just make sure that you hold on to anything that you'd like to ask or say at this point around anything that you have in your mind until the discussion part at noon. And make notes, okay? Put them, we have lots of time to really work on things, but for once, after so many weeks, I want to finally get going on the content earlier rather than 20 minutes late. We have so much ground to cover. Great. So, well, you may be aware that last night there was quite a remarkable address that the American president gave to the American public and the world. It's called the State of the Union Address in Washington that the president gives once a year. And it was remarkable in its combativeness. And the reason I mention this now as we begin this story is because there has never been a time, as the commentators are now saying today, where an American president during a State of the Union has been so political and so aggressive. And he talked a lot about a person, not by name, he just said his predecessor, something like 14 or 15 times. What the American president did last night instill the dominant democratic power in the world, for better or for worse. It's undeniable. Doesn't matter what you say. The United States is the largest democratic power in the world, for better or for worse. And what the American president said last night is, in the upcoming election this year in the United States, it will be an election about freedom and democracy. And for the first time in a long time, this has become the primary topic of the State of the Union and of the American election. Joe Biden summoned an American president, Franklin Roosevelt, last night from 1941 during the Second World War. He summoned Abraham Lincoln as well. And he basically said that this is now a choice in his mind between a force, a very reactionary conservative force that staged an insurrection against its own capital not too long ago, that wants to take the United States in a different direction. And Joe Biden, for better or for worse, said, I stand for the higher values of freedom and democracy, not grievance, anger, and vindictiveness, which is, I'm afraid, what the other side tends to stand for. Anger, a lot of anger. Freedom and democracy are huge stories in the entire human adventure on Earth in terms of human and civilization. And I want to remind you that as we now pick up the story by looking increasingly at the civilizations and societies around the world that began to become most powerful in the human story, the one underlying force that is there in our story, along with evolution that you have seen so much of, is this desire for humans to be more free. And so for the leader of such a large country to stand up in front of his electorate and the members of Congress and basically say, for the first time in a long, long time, we Americans now have to worry about our democracy and whether it will continue, is hugely significant. And that's why I want to wake all of you up to the idea that this is a year of democracy in 2024. 40 national elections are taking place around the world, and they will culminate in the American election in November or December. So if you care about freedom and you care about the human story, you need to be thinking this year about what you see around the world and where we are going. Because as you probably have begun to sense, humans like strong men in power. And that was our first choice in our governments all over the world. They're called the God Kings. They were not Democrats. Do not think that everything I'm about to show you in terms of empires that grew with the God King and authoritarians, or what we might call emperors or tyrants or dictators, is over in human history. That's what I want to help you to understand today as we continue to explore this story on the backs of many giants and world historians. And that is the idea that freedom and human rights and the things that all of you take for granted are quite fragile. And we could lose them. Do not think, do not take for granted that the life you have right now, where you can think freely and make your own choices, is the way it will always be. And as I pointed out in a previous class to Stephen, I reminded him, and I will remind you, but he knows his history quite well, Adolf Hitler, who was probably the poster person for cruelty and tyranny in the 20th century, was elected by his people. There was a republic, a democracy in Germany. It was called the Weimar Republic. And as I pointed out as well, after he was elected, the Reichstag burnt down in Berlin. And, well, we will get there. Theodore Zeldin is another world historian that I will be telling you a lot about as well, along with William McNeill and Jacob Bronowski. He's written a remarkable history of the world called An Intimate History of Humanity. And he's somebody that I will be referring to today because guess what? Today is International Women's Day. I will be holding an event here this evening with the Rotary Club in which women will be featured, and our new president will be with me as well, Elaine Popp, who's just taken over from Don Lavisa. In Theodore Zeldin's Intimate History of Humanity, he actually said something quite important about women in the story of humanity. And I'm going to start the story shortly. I'm just setting up our giant for today before we get into the story and go back to Greece and Rome and take you through quite a few hundred years up until the conquest. Theodore Zeldin said, there is a force in the human story that is irreversible. And it doesn't matter how fanatic governments get, how much they want to take us backwards, how religiously fanatic or extreme they are, and usually in religious extremism, there isn't much place for women. In all religions, pretty well. When they get extreme, women get pushed to the side. Theodore Zeldin said there is a force that cannot be changed, and that is women's rights. That the the rights that women have won for themselves in the last 300-400 years have become the most important force in the human story. In most of human history, as you've seen, where were the women? They weren't there because the men were writing the history. And occasionally a woman would come to power, and you saw Nefertiti, for example, the Egyptian pharaoh, and there have been other queens along the way here and there, but of course you know the name Cleopatra in Egypt, but there are many others. But by no means have women ever been part of the historical narrative the way they should be. And we know that in food production and agriculture, as I've shown you, it was the women farmers largely who went into the forests and figured out how to take berries and plants and things and bring them to the farms so they could grow food and become farmers. Men weren't doing that, women were largely. So here we are on International Day of Women, March the 8th, 2024, and I thought it would be appropriate to remind you that there's an important world historian, and his name is Theodore Zeldin, and I highly recommend his book called Intimate History of Humanity. Now, we ended with this idea in the previous classes about being awake to your own power. And I just want to stop for a moment because everything is going so well, and I'm just having a slight moment of paranoia that something's going to go wrong. Okay, but hold on. I want to check. Is everything okay online? Stephen, can you hear me loud and clear? Perfect. Okay, so it's all working. Great. And Stephen, I want to remind you that we will have lots of time at noon to talk about these things. So I look forward to engaging you as always in these discussions. So I'm reviewing a little bit where we left off. When I finished 2 weeks ago, before we had the break, I ended with a reading from Plato in his account of the death of his mentor, Socrates. And it was the Greeks in this little peninsula sticking out into the Mediterranean, the Peloponnese, as Nico knows from Greece and helped us to understand it a little bit more. That part of the world, 2,500 years ago, in what is sometimes called the lamp of humankind, the golden age of Athens, 400s BCE. In that 100-year period, there was a tremendous growth in free thinking, but it also ended quite tragically. But an idea came out of there that's very important. You are not awake to your own power. The person who helped us to understand this was the perhaps most enduring philosopher in not just Western civilization, but probably global civilization in some ways. The Socratic method of constantly challenging power, asking questions, essentially renouncing or diminishing the importance of money and glory and military might, and bringing the idea of intellectual inquiry, critical thinking, and creative intelligence and free thinking to the fore. That was Socrates. And Socrates gave us these important ideas that culminate in you are not awake to your own power. But he paid dearly for his commitment to this free thinking. And that's where we ended last class, where I read to you the account of his suicide in 399 BCE, when he had a choice and he decided to die, go to his grave for his principles. This death is centuries before Jesus of Nazareth was nailed to the cross, and he too was a person of great principle. But it needs to be said that for those of you who believe that Jesus of Nazareth is the only person who has come to save humanity and who was prepared to die for his beliefs, you are historically wrong. There are others who have come before him and who did exactly the same thing, and we must respect them. I'm going to move on now with the story of at least the final stages of the Greek Empire and begin to tell you more about how Greece grew into Rome and how the Roman Empire fell and how the Mediterranean grew into a super empire that would produce other warriors and leaders and emperors. But the most important thing I want to return to for the purposes of this lecture is to remind you that the forces that we live with today are not that much different than what humans have lived with in previous societies. For example, Greece, the ancient golden age of Athens, did not last very long. And there's a reason for that that has to do with infectious disease. We just came through a pandemic. Well, during the golden age of Athens, Pericles, whom you met, the leader of Athens during its war against the enemy Persia and others, he fell ill from a plague. As a matter of fact, this plague, which has never been fully understood, decimated the people of Athens, who were fighting at that point against Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And we have an account of this plague and how significant it was from no less than the father, we often say, of modern history, Thucydides. There were two Greeks who were writing history from an eyewitness account for the first time. This had not existed in other human societies to this extent, but the Greeks were writing and they were thinking and they were also chronicling their times voluminously. They were writing like journalists. So there was one historian, and his name was Herodotus, and Herodotus wrote the history of the Persian Wars, which the Greeks won. But then his student, Thucydides, wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, which Athens lost. And in his account of that, Thucydides gives a blow-by-blow description of the plague that befell Athens. And just give me a moment. So many things today, technically. I didn't get the exact page teed up here with Thucydides, and it is right here. I got Herodotus. Here we are. Okay. Peloponnesian War. And right close to the start, we have, here we go. Okay. Right. I'm not going to waste time finding the exact spot because I didn't tee it up and I don't have it right here, but there are two important things that you need to know about this. I have my Herodotus teed up, but not Thucydides. You have two important things. The first is in Thucydides' account of Pericles, he gives a very famous eyewitness account of a speech that Pericles gave during the war, where Pericles speaks about how Athens is this shining example for the rest of the world of free thinking and democracy. And it's a very famous speech. It's the oration that Pericles gave at a funeral for the fallen soldiers of the war. But then virtually on the next pages of his classic, The Peloponnesian War, Thucydides begins to give a blow-by-blow account of the plague that came soon after, that killed so many. The rise and fall of empires that we're all interested in, the reason why some civilizations become dominant and powerful and then fade, the reason why the United States may not continue to be the power it has always been, the reason why it's important for you to think of our story as one in which power comes and goes, borders get drawn and redrawn, things change, is because there are forces underlying our story that humans grapple with and have trouble with. One of those forces is infectious disease. William McNeill, the other great world historian I have spoken of, who wrote Plagues and Peoples after his great Rise of the West, History of the Human Community, speaks at length about our inability to deal with these natural forces. We are lucky today. You may not be aware, but we are past the pandemic. There are vaccines. There's a reason why we're not wearing masks now and we're back together. It's not because it just ended. It's not because there was no pandemic and it was all just a conspiracy theory. It's because there was a concerted medical effort to deal with a bacterium or a virus, which are the two greatest enemies for humans. Hold your thought, okay, John? I just want to make sure. So Athens, the great Athens, Pericles, its statesmen, they were defeated by Sparta in large part because they lost the men who could fight. Nonetheless, when we speak of Greece in the human story, we talk about often what's called an intellectual empire. That even though Athens and Greece have disappeared, the ideas that they brought to us have continued. Once you open the door to an idea, and once that idea can be transferred, communicated via writing, via language, via some way, some medium, you can't put that idea back in its box. Socrates had a student, you're looking at him, and his name was Plato. Plato wrote The Last Days of Socrates, and he also is considered the early creator of the first school, the first place where humans come together and begin to debate and discuss. And that was done right beneath the Acropolis in Athens. The Acropolis is sort of, if you can picture Athens for a moment, it sits around a hill. And there's a hill at the top, it's called the Acropolis. And on the Acropolis are all some of the most important buildings in ancient Athens, like the Parthenon, for example, and others. And the life that would take place around the Acropolis 400 years ago was called the Agora. It was a marketplace, and humans would come and they would debate and discuss. Around that marketplace, near there were groves and areas where Plato would bring people together and they would discuss things and debate. And then there was Aristotle, who was Plato's student, and he wrote extensively. Socrates wrote nothing, just like Jesus. Jesus did not record anything. It was the people who came after him that did. And here's what Aristotle said in the Politics about the idea of freedom. A man should live as he likes. This, they say, is the privilege of a free man, since not to live as a man likes is the mark of a slave. This is the second characteristic of democracy, whence has risen the claim of men to be ruled by none, and if possible, or if this is impossible, to rule and be ruled and turns. And so it contributes to the freedom based upon equality. We are seeing, for the first time in human history, a proclamation of how important freedom is, equality is, how slavery must be addressed. But by no means was this a revolution. There were still women who had no role or no rights in these societies. There were slaves, still, many. There were all sorts of what we would call human rights abuses at that time. But nonetheless, as Alfred North Whitehead would say, we are seeing a flash of freedom. A door is being opened to free thought, and you can't close that door again quite the same way you have in the past. This door keeps being opened. It began with Abraham. Let me try and give you an idea of what it means to be awake to your own power in a very simple way, so that you can understand something about how what Nikos long ago ancestors brought to our human story, why it's so important. We call this critical thinking. So here we go. Aristotle wrote a book called On the Heavens. We say that is, to some extent, an early version of science, when we no longer are ascribing power to the gods. We're beginning to use common sense to understand things. So think of an eclipse. This is what Aristotle did. He would look up into the sky and he would look at the objects in the sky as other Greek philosophers and scientists would do. And he saw that one day the moon had a shadow across it. We now know this is an eclipse. But in the past, what we would say was that, well, the moon is a mystery. And the moon god is now angry because the moon god is showing darkness. We would ascribe the things that we did not understand to a supernatural power. And when you do that, you limit yourself. We humans limit ourselves. We might even say, but this is going a little far, we become weak. We become mentally weak. To be mentally strong is to look clearly at something and try to understand, why is it working the way it really does? For example, I look at John. I look at the student here. Look at the student back there. And I might go, well, they need to be texting and talking, but a really good mind would ask, why is the human being so attached to their machines? Why does the human being create a machine and then seem to become a slave of it, to the point where they can't control their use of it, to the point where they can't put their machines aside and look at the other human and listen to the human? No, I'm not ever going to criticize Nico for scrolling or anybody else for using their laptop if they're taking notes. But I might ask, if I really wanted to understand, instead of getting frustrated with students, a good mind would go, I wonder why students can't seem to control the compulsion to use their machines. And then it would take me down a road into a place called neuroscience, and I may learn something about how the electrons and machines are working on the human brain. But if Aristotle were standing here right now, and he was looking at all of you, he would be very curious, as I am, about why you do what you do. He would not be so interested in entertainment, in constant distraction, in the need to stay connected all the time to your machine. He would be looking around him at everything and trying to understand, why does it work the way it does? And so in his mind, he figured out, oh, there's a reason why there's a shadow on the moon right now. And it appears to be that the sun is behind the earth, and the earth is moving around the sun, not the other way around. It's called a heliocentric world, not a geocentric world. For a lot of human history, we were under the impression that that everything revolves around us. Just the way you were when you were 5 years old or 10 years old, and you think everything revolves around you. You don't know anything else but what you want, how you want to eat, and what your parent is going to do for you. But Aristotle looked up and he started to understand, yeah, sun moving, earth moving. Well, I guess then the sun is projecting off the earth, and that is projecting a shadow onto the moon. And so what we're seeing is the earth's shape on the moon. And therefore the earth, because it's a kind of circular shape on the moon, it's probably round too. This is called science. It's called observation. And it is something that I'm afraid a lot of us don't do too much anymore. As a matter of fact, in history, there were leaders, God kings, who understood this. They were the ones with knowledge. They were the ones who were reading. They were the ones who were learning from people like Aristotle and Plato and others. And one of them was named Alexander the Great. Do you know that Aristotle was his teacher? Alexander, as a young man, grew up in a court in Macedon, which is just north of Greece. Macedonia, Macedon, you still hear both, but Macedonia, we say today. And some even call it Macedonia in history, but it just depends. I'll say Macedon for the moment because that's often the historical term. But you're right, John, Macedonia today. What's that? Macedon. Yeah, exactly. So in the 300s, there was a powerful figure in Macedon. He was the king of Macedon. And his son was Alexander. The king was assassinated. It's believed by one of the Persian god kings. Alexander came to power in immense privilege. I want to spend a bit of time on him, not a lot, but enough for you to understand a critical idea about being awake to your own power. And why he was lucky to, but most people weren't, and he knew that. When he came to power as a teenager, after his father had been assassinated, and he had learned so much from the Greek philosophers just across the border, whom his father had brought to the court in Macedon to teach him these great Hellenistic ideas. Greece was not called Greece then, it was called Hellas. And the ideas that they had were called Hellenism, the culture of Hellenism. And to be a Hellene, to be thinking Hellenistically, was advanced progressive thinking. And that's exactly what Alexander's father wanted for his son. To fill his his head with Hellenistic ideas of free thinking and science and military glory. Alexander was a person who understood something about the human will. Every dictator, every emperor, and soon I will tell you about Napoleon Bonaparte and how he understood this, they all understand something that we all must be very aware of. And that is, they realize that once they understand the power of their own will, their lack of fear to force themselves on you, their courage to confront you, but also the privilege that some of them have had to be educated so that they can speak you down, talk you down, make you feel stupid and small. Well, this is something tyrants often understand. It's no surprise that one of the great pieces of propaganda that Hitler had during the Second World War was a movie that he made about his rallies called Triumph of the Will. Triumph of the Will. Alexander understood this very well, but he was also well educated. But he was under the impression that the way to expand is through military might. And he was strategically very smart, but he'd been educated. And most of the people in Macedon at that time, as well as many people in Hellas, were not educated, did not have access to the ideas that Aristotle and Plato and others had brought to them. The door had been opened, but there were still many, many who were not so aware and could be easily manipulated. Alexander undertook a tremendous military campaign when he essentially, in a matter of a few years, in his early 20s, think about this, at your age or a little older, he commanded an army and a navy, forces in which he was able to conquer not only Hellas or Greece, but he moved using Greek ideas of conquest. It's called the hoplites or the phalanx. I will explain that in a moment. Or the triremes, the navy. I will explain that too. But essentially, what he did in very short order is he moved across the sea into what was then Persia. He defeated the Persians at last, chased them out of their cities. And he continued on as far as India. And along the way, he established behind him what are called Alexandrias. These were cities that were all named Alexandria. And the most important of them in history is the one in Egypt that I'm about to tell you about. That's where the Library of Alexandria was, and I showed you some of that before. The Alexandria of Egypt was like the New York of its day. This is something interesting about Alexander that needs to be said so that you can understand something about how our leaders begin to get the support that they do. He was not afraid to absorb other ideas. This is partly why he was so successful. First, the military tactics that he used to organize his men, the infantry, the fighting land forces, they were called the hoplites. And they organized themselves in what's called a phalanx. Now, this was a Greek idea or a Hellenistic idea, and he adopted it for himself. He was smart. Let me explain to you how, in this formation of a phalanx, you have a power in there that has a lot to do with democracy. You may be under the impression that a strong army and a strong military has to do with the soldiers and the men fighting out of fear. Fear that they are going to somehow disappoint their commanding officer, fear that they're going to let down the other men that they're fighting with, fear that they will not do the right and heroic thing. But actually, love and higher ideals, the desire to be free, is also a very important part of military power. Because in this phalanx, there would be a large group, sometimes about 500 men, all in rows and columns, moving shoulder to shoulder. And they would have their spears up like this, and at the front, the men would have their shields in front of them. And along the sides, the other men would have their shields around them. And this entire box, if you will, would move as one. It was such an overwhelming force coming at you. 500 men walking in perfect unison. And then the men in front would put out their spears, they would hold them, and they would just mow you down. And if they were taking in any incoming spears, arrows, or any other kind of projectiles, there were no bullets yet, they could ward them off with the shields. But think of this. Inside that phalanx were all people from all walks of life. All you had to do to be a member of a phalanx was show up with your shield and your spear. Thanks, Nicole. We'll see you again. And you would say, I want to fight for Greece. I want to fight for our ideals. And so it was possible that in this phalanx, you would have not a slave. No slaves are allowed yet, so it's not quite there. But you would have somebody who was maybe the poorest of the poor, a farmer's son, who would be shoulder to shoulder with a general's son. And once they got into this phalanx, they were all equal. William McNeill has made this very clear in his history that the power of the forces that Alexander was able to unleash on the world had a lot to do with the Greek ideas of democracy. When we talk about these other forces that are so important in our story as we move along, we have to talk about the idea of what the Library of Alexandria represented. And Alexander understood something about the power of knowledge. We might call him an enlightened despot today. A dictator, an emperor, somebody who was all about one-man rule. But he was not stupid and not unaware of what was happening in the rest of the world. And so what he did is that every single city that he conquered and named after Alexandria, he made sure that every single scroll that had been written in any place was immediately brought back to Alexandria in Egypt and put into the library there. And so the Library of Alexandria became essentially the world's first public library. Not completely, but we're still a long way from everybody having access to knowledge like we have on the internet. But it was a place where you could walk in there and there were up to 1 million or more scrolls that had been brought from all of these far-flung places that had been conquered. And in there, we see that knowledge is being contained. And this knowledge that Alexander had brought into this one place will eventually become knowledge that all of us will have access to. And when we start to have access to that knowledge, the world is going to change even faster. I want to take just the final 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to start with our discussion to begin to talk about another part of the world that is so important. The story of what happened in Greece and around the Mediterranean, and particularly in Alexander of Macedon and his campaign to conquer the Eastern world and spread his ideas there, has been told a lot. And many of you are probably familiar with what I've said to some extent. I do want to remind you that to end his story, we need to go to India. And first, before I tell you about a very important force that comes out of India that is going to begin to change the world, it's important to understand that Alexander wanted India. He got there. And for the Indians here, I can see, it's a kind of interesting to think about this for a moment, that had he gone further, it would be a very different world. But he wanted too much to be revered as a god. This is partly his downfall. God kings, they become excessive if they're not confronted. They will begin to truly believe that they have that divine right over all of us. And even though Alexander was revered by his men for the way he fought with them, he wasn't a general standing back on a hill looking out over the forces. He was right there fighting with his men. And he was a very capable and brave warrior. First, he said to his men, "We must continue into India now." The men were beginning to get tired. They weren't sure there was a need to go much further, but they would have fought for him if he had cared about them, as he had. But he had started to tell others, including those closest to him, that when he's addressed, you cannot look at him anymore. You must be prostrate. When you come into Alexander's audience, don't look. It's what the god kings all do. I am above you. I know more than you. You, human, you do not look at me. He was also a pretty heavy drinker. He liked to party. He liked to have sex. And it said he even liked to have sex with his horse, although we don't know that for certain. But he liked to have sex with women, men, and he wanted to even give his horse some sort of political powers. He loved his horse. Hold your question for a second. We might say that he was becoming a little drunk with his power. The opposite was happening in India. This is a remarkable story, and I need to tell it, and then we're going to stop. Please raise a hand if any of you know the name Ashoka. You ever heard the name Ashoka? Of course, there's an Indian student here who might. Around the same time that Alexander got to India and his men would not fight for him the way he wanted anymore, and he had to retreat back to Babylon, where he then burnt down Babylon, and he died in his early 30s. It's said of alcoholism and other things, perhaps, but he didn't last very long. He did not have a long life. India was an interesting place at that time. It too had had god kings and authoritarian figures who had expanded the Indian Empire. But But something different took place there when it comes to the way we ought to live, the way we ought to live together. It starts with a remarkable figure named Siddhartha Gautama. You're looking at him or a kind of replica of him right now. Around this time in history, there was a kind of Indian prince. He was not at the same level as Alexander had been in terms of Alexander growing up in a court of a king, but Prince Siddhartha Gautama came from a place of privilege and wealth. And he was on his way to becoming a powerful figure. But he decided that that wasn't enough. In fact, in his cocoon, in his little world of wealth and privilege, where he didn't have much contact with others around him in the village or town, he started to wonder, who are those people outside? All those ordinary people. Whenever I go for a walk and I leave this compound, I see quite a bit of suffering. And then he started to ask himself a question. Well, why are they suffering? And he started to wonder, why am I suffering internally? Imagine Alexander asking him this question, himself the question. He never would be so introspective in this way, so gentle of spirit, so brave. It has been said by one great psychoanalyst of the 20th century, Carl Jung, your vision can only become clear when you look into your own heart. He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakes. Prince Gautama looked inside, and he didn't like what he saw. And so, as the story goes, in one of his long walks, he went into the forest. Try to think for a moment of what you do when you are burdened by something. You want to make up your mind. You're not sure what to do. You have a conflict, an internal conflict. Some men in history will lash out. They will go conquer. They will want more and more and more. But the prince was tuned into something. It seems like the human appetite is immense. It seems like the more we get, the more we want. Well, how do we stop this? Why am I suffering? So he took a long, long walk into nature. Just like sometimes when you are burdened with something, really burdened, and you don't want to escape it by going online and surfing and watching this, and that's all just escapism. It's just distraction. When you really have to make up your mind about something, you're going to unplug all the machines, and you're probably going to go for a walk somewhere. You're probably going to find a place where you can be quiet. And that's what he did. He went and sat under a tree, as the story goes, for a long, long time. He just sat there, and he sat, and he tried to understand the answer to a question. Why is there so much suffering? Why is there so much suffering? Well, I'm going to conclude and set up our discussion today by just telling you that the answer to his question was very powerful and was eventually adopted by a king, Ashoka. The Indian king Ashoka was similar to Alexander in that he had expanded the empire so much so that he started to face some questions himself. And he turned to Ashoka, so he turned to the prince to answer them. By that time, the idea and the answer to the question of why we're suffering so much had started to spread and became the basis of Buddhism. You're seeing the beginnings of Buddhism, the powerful force in the Eastern world. For the Westerners here, it may not be so meaningful. We have our Judaism, we have our Christianity, we have our Islam. But that's the West, although Islam is everywhere. It's a very powerful idea that has been adopted by many, many societies, like Christianity too. But Buddhism, if you go east, you go into Japan, you go into India, you go to that part of the world, you will see that it has a very deep meaning in there. And it will be in Buddhism that Ashoka, John, listen to this. It's in Buddhism that Ashoka is going to find a new way. And Ashoka is going to do something that no god king, no emperor, no leader in human history had ever done up until that point. He is going to renounce violence. This was adopted by Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi in the 20th century, when he led India to a place where it potentially could be a part of the world that united two great religions, Hinduism and Islam, and eventually he was assassinated for that by an extremist. He reached back to Ashoka. So did Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. He also talked about Ashoka, about renouncing violence, about adopting education, about respecting women and animals, and all of these things we might call humanity. Well, that answer that the prince came to sitting under the tree that became the basis of Buddhism, the answer to the question, why are we suffering so much, is a pretty powerful idea. We're going to work on that in our discussion momentarily. And I hope that for the Indian students among us who are straight from India, that maybe they can help us a little bit more in understanding the power of Ashoka and the power of this thinking and the power of Prince Siddhartha Gautama's ideas for all of us. So I'm going to stop there and take a moment and celebrate internally the fact that I've gone a little long, but I think this is the first lecture I've given in a long, long time where we're almost to time at last. So why don't you take a stand up for just stretch a little bit or just take a deep breath, get ready. And we need to write a question in large print on the smartboard by somebody who's ready to write. And what's your name again? Oh, you're Murnau. Yes, great. How is your English? Is it okay? Writing it? Could you go over to the smartboard for a second, Murnau? Thank you. We're going to show him how to write something, okay? And get ready for the question, and I'll just help him. And for the onliners too, why are we suffering so much? And just write like really big, why are we suffering so much? Okay. So here we are. And I might find somewhere Thucydides again, but I never can do everything. All right, who feels like standing up? Because today we have no high chairs, and so we're going to have to be, and I know I can go default to Sarah. Okay, John, Nico, Jazeel, you ready? Yeah? Why don't you come stand over here? Okay, come stand the podium here, and why don't we say, you feel it? Feel like I'm up? You okay? Yeah, you're okay. All right, John. Yeah, because you may want to put a plug in for your big event too. Okay. So come on over there. Jazeel's got that. I'm going to move around. Let's see what's happening on the big board with our Cosmos. Why don't we? Great. We've got Mirinel over there. Excellent. It's Mirinel. Mrinel. Where are you from? India. Okay. So we've got good Indian representation. Jazeel, Mirinel, and what part? India too? You're from here? Okay. But originally, like father, grandfather, mother. Sri Lanka. That's close to India, but it's not quite the same. Okay, good. All right. We are now ready to begin. Why don't we go to the Cosmos and see first? We'll start there. Is there anybody there who would like to start to try and answer this question of why do we suffer so much? Go for it, Stephen. Please jump on your microphone, okay?
So the question is, why are we suffering? Is that?
Yes. The answer.
Well, I mean, it's a pretty simple question for me to answer because of my political and, religious beliefs, but I think suffering is basically the reason, why we live. It's the reason for life, pretty much.
Suffering is the reason for life. Okay. All right. Well, hold on. I just want to make sure we've got the right view for YouTube there. Good. Okay. Myrna, could you write that down? Suffering is the reason.
A better way to put it is we exist to suffer, I think.
We exist to suffer. Oops. Let me get this back here. Okay, good. We're just a moment, a tech issue here. Okay. We exist to suffer. So I want to remind you, we're trying to understand the answer to this question so that we can understand why Ashoka would adopt these ideas and why he would decide he doesn't want to fight war anymore. He doesn't want to kill people anymore. There's a famous battle where it said he had his crisis. I think it's called Kalinga. Kalinga, where the body count was in the tens of thousands. And he wondered, does it really have to be like this anymore? So it's important in what Stephen is saying and what we answer, because I hate to remind you, but we're living in the 21st century where we're seeing every day a lot of death from war, by the way. And it could get worse. So something's wrong. Right? Okay, good. So we exist to suffer. John, you want to try? And, and then we'll go to Jazeel, and then we'll keep. Thanks, Stephen. We're going to continue.
Yeah, I think Stephen's got a point here. It's like it does happen a lot in life, like not just in populations, but like individuals as well. And I think one of the reasons for that is, I know we're on a different topic now, but it's like we aren't awake to our own power in a way, just because there's, people that are they might be in higher authority than us, higher influence than us, parents, teachers. They're the ones who make all the decisions in our life, and where it, might lead some people, myself included, as I have grown up, to, really, they don't want to take risks because they don't want to they might not want to stand against influence or authority, like, you know, or like say some, or like do the right thing for fear that, you know, it might hit the fan, you know?
Yeah, well, that four-letter word is just
Yeah,
definite.
hitting the
It looks like
fan.
it, and I think we know. Okay,
Yeah.
but why do we suffer? The prince walks out and he's trying to understand, why are all these people suffering, and why am I suffering so much and with this? And then Ashoka is asking himself that, why am I suffering so much, and I'm killing all these people and the empire is growing? What do you think? What's the root of the suffering?
It's not an easy question to answer, if I'm being honest, Lon. There's just, you know, a lot behind it. There's a lot of why people suffered back then, why people suffer to this day, why populations did it back then and to this day. There's no one size fits all answer for that, in my opinion.
John,
Oh, Sarah had her hand up.
I hate to say it, but
Sure.
the prince sat under a tree for a long, long, long time, for days, it said, before he came up with the answer. So he went to a quiet place because he wanted to answer the question, and he answered it. So it's not good enough for you to say that. It just isn't. Sorry. Okay, so let's keep going.
Okay.
Hold on. We're going to let Jazeel, and then we're going to go to Nico. Okay, let Jazeel go first, and then, yeah.
So I don't go with the idea we exist to suffer. It became a part of life. Suffering become part of life from the old age. We evaluation, mutation, we became a human. And then time there was no suffering. There was only survival. And the suffering comes and we make it as a part of our life. And that's why we continue to suffer. And then he shows the way to quit the suffering. Actually, I don't remember the answer. It was taught in our sixth or seventh grade. Yeah, yeah. And I'm not good at remembering things.
It's okay.
So I don't remember his. And about Ashoka, he seen many dead bodies, many people's crying. And then he started questioning, and then he started to follow him. And he spread his ideology over many countries
Yes.
like Sri Lanka, China, Japan, Malaysia, and there also you will find his statue is there also.
It's interesting because
Yeah.
there's a very active area of research going on today, and will continue to see if there were any people from the Mediterranean world at this time, which is we're talking about 2003 to 400 years ago. This is again 400 years before Jesus. Was there any contact between the Mediterranean world and the Indian world that would have brought these ideas back and would have influenced the formation of Christianity? Because Christianity, as Stephen will help us to understand, is rooted greatly in love, too. Love, that's what Jesus was saying. Everyone is equal and should all be loved. So was the prince. But let's keep. So, Jazeel, you're saying that really you don't think we exist to suffer.
We don't exist to suffer, we make it a part of our life.
Yes. Thanks, John. Okay. So, what are you thinking?
I agree with him. I think we don't exist to suffer. I think we exist to live. And through living, there is suffering. And then through that
What
suffering,
does living mean though?
Good. Okay.
Like define living in the world.
Who wants it? Go ahead, Jazeel. Go ahead.
So the meaning of living, we everyone has a goal. We everyone has to achieve something. We make something to live in this world. And the suffering is the end of the living thing. It makes us to think to end our life. Everyone has a goal, anything, and they make that thing to live. In past, to rule was a thing to live. That's the living.
He's asking. We'll let Nico.
I don't entirely.
What's the question again? What is living? Like what?
Well, no, I said to like define what living is, and what I was gonna say is like the state that we exist in right now it is like it's suffering basically. Like we suffer like every single day with our struggles and whatever.
Yeah, but through that suffering, there is living.
Well, but
And
again, like what does living mean? Is it to have a goal or is it to suffer?
it can be anything you want it to be.
But you're saying that there's something beyond the suffering.
Yeah, the suffering is like it's different for every single person. For me, for suffering makes you stronger and then better to live your life. People now might not agree, but that's how I see it. I'm not gonna just be here and be like, "Oh, life is suffering, everything sucks." I'm not gonna be like that.
Do you think life is happiness though? Or do you think it's happiness and suffering?
It depends how you perceive it.
Well, we experience happiness at points and we also suffer at points. So, do you think life is just like suffering and happiness? Just imagine suffering and happiness as like a spectrum and each are the opposite of each other. Do you think life is a combination of those?
I think it's pretty like in between. If you want me to be honest,
I think
like
I
it
think it
has to be.
I think
Sorry.
it tilts towards the side of the side of suffering.
Well, you can't just live to suffer, and you can't just live to live. You can't just suffer to live. Just like I said before, um, there has to be a mix of both, or else you're not living your life at all. And you're not living your life through suffering. You're not suffering your life to live.
Stephen, do you understand why King Ashoka would decide that he no longer wanted to fight war? That he no longer believed that violence was a way to achieve anything of substance, and that there had to be another way, and he was prepared to change his society for that very reason. Does that make sense to you, Stephen?
Well, what are you asking me?
I'm Ashoka's decision to adopt Buddhism as the state religion is exactly what you will see in the Roman world. Constantine did this with Christianity and spread Christianity across the Roman Empire. But many centuries before he did that, there was a king in India who adopted this religion, Buddhism, and in that was no violence, no war. Does that make sense to you that a leader would do that, or do you think he was wrong?
Yes.
It does. Okay. And why would he do that, Stephen? Why would he
Because
change?
war is it's prolonged suffering on a mass scale. And he didn't want that for his people, so
So there's
that's why he chose peace instead of war.
Okay, thanks. Jazeel, go ahead.
So the suffering end at the end of the war. He done with his kingdom. He done with the war, and he end the suffering. So suffering never exists. He break down
Are
suffer.
you making the point that suffering doesn't exist because you're not at war?
Yeah,
Are
you
you saying
say.
are you saying that war equals suffering? Are you
No,
saying
no,
that
no.
you
I am
can't
not
suffer
saying. I
outside
am
of a
saying
war?
that you say because of war the suffering exists. After the war there is no suffering. I am saying that thing. I am not saying the war equal to
Okay, I
suffering.
disagree though.
For different people, there are different things which they suffer. I am not saying the war equal to suffering.
But by ending.
But you're saying because of the
Yeah.
war, people were suffering.
Yeah, he think
So,
because of the
getting
war,
rid of the
people
war is getting
suffer.
rid of all suffering.
Stephen, let Jazeel finish. Okay, go ahead.
Ashoka think that because of my purpose, because of my greed, other people suffer. I suffer. I has to take that pain on my shoulder. So let's end all this and free everyone from the suffering which was caused by the war. I'm not saying the war is equal to suffering.
You're not saying that war ends suffering.
Yeah.
War reduces. The
Yeah.
end of war reduces suffering.
Yeah.
It doesn't end suffering. It
See,
just reduces the suffering.
every people has something in the suffering. Someone has not that thing, I want that thing. They just suffer on that thing. Like a newborn baby, what he has to achieve in the world. He's a 1 2 year, 1 2 days, he not have any suffering in his life. He just start to living, and it's came in the life. Suffering never exists in anyone. It just came in the life, and we make it a part of our life.
We often say all babies, all children are
Yeah.
born free.
Yeah.
And the worst is when they start to live. But okay, John, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to respond to two of Steven's points here, like I feel like there's kind of actually two types of suffering caused by war. One being direct and the other being indirect. Even if people aren't like directly targeted in a war, for example, like they could still be like suffering tremendously, like just by virtue of being in the location of the war, for example, where they might have to go to another country to escape it, for example. That's more of an example of indirect suffering. And then the second point, like suffering versus living, like, and he was wondering what living means, and he was like asking us to define what living means. I think of it of being two ways. You're either living on this planet or you're simply existing in it. And to me, having somebody simply exist in it is unacceptable. Like I think they should always be able to live authentically. They should be able to have the personal freedom to like go out, be with their friends and just live the authentic self with those that they have, you know. Whereas if they're like just existing, they're like no knock on these people because I live in one, like in a small town, for example, as opposed to a big city, you know, they're just they're just kind of existing. Whereas like, I don't know entirely how to put it. And there's no, like I said, there's no one size fits all to answer, but like there's a clear difference between existing and living. That's what living kind of means to me, is Stephen's point. Like sometimes I feel like I'm just existing, but more recently, I felt like I'm living, whether people like Nico might be living, Sarah might be living, Lon, you might be living, something like that. We all kind of go through those times of existing and living. We should never have to just exist. We should always be able to live.
Could I respond to that?
Sure. I was going to ask you. Go ahead, Stephen. Please do.
So are you making the case that existing in a small town is not like are you saying that like small town like living in a small town is just like suffering and living in a big city is living authentically? Is that your point? Like
No, that's just sort of one example. I'm just making it up. Obviously, like I kind of live in a small town, so I'm not here to knock like small towns down. It's just like I don't know, like just personally from
you
what
think they don't like have as much to live for, or
they might
like
not.
they okay.
They
So
might not.
Hold on. I want to say that the discussion you're having is terrific because you guys are talking about big, basic things. Stephen, you're asking great questions. I know you're asking honest questions. John, you're answering. Keep going, guys, and try to work this through. Then we're going to put some notes on, and then we're going to end the class. Okay? So go
Yep.
ahead.
Um, yeah, like they honestly might not. Like, and just, small town is one example. Like, they might not be a person who goes out and gets many friends, for example. They might not have any friends. Whereas, like, somebody who does have, like, it doesn't matter the size, like, but is at least like past that threshold of not having any friends, for example, or not going out to get any friends, they're living, like, or they only have a small number. I was in that exact same situation where, I felt like I was just existing coming into my second year of college with only 3 friends. But when I expanded my group significantly, for example, I felt like, more living, for example. It's like, it's what people are getting out of life, Stephen, and how, like, the quantity of what they're getting out of life that determines whether they're existing or living.
and so you think existing is suffering and living is happiness?
Yeah, it can be.
So people who are living cannot like they're not experiencing like suffering like on a normal basis.
I don't think they are, like, not in their personal lives at least. Like, maybe there might be a couple small things that they're going through, but, like, on, like, a consistent suffering, like, they're living, like, a suffering lifestyle, if you wanna put it that way, then, yeah, I don't think they're suffering like that.
Well, I guess I could agree with that. I wouldn't use your words though of like living and existing. I think living is just living, and some people live a certain lifestyle that they suffer a lot, and some people live a certain lifestyle where they experience happiness on uh, a normal basis more often.
Fair enough.
But one thing that I do disagree with a lot actually is you saying that living in a small town, you know, you have less to live for than like as opposed to somebody who lives in a big city, because you could make the point that someone who lives in a big city, they have to pay like, you know, a lot more for rent, and they have to like live in a tiny little apartment, while somebody who lives in the countryside can walk around in a field and not, you know, have a bunch of space to themselves. I think there's a lot of I guess it kind of just depends on the person whether you're existing in a small town or living in a small town, and existing in a big city or living in a big city. I think that if you like living in a big city, then you're living in a big city, but if you hate living in a big city, then you're just existing in one. And
Okay,
same
let's
thing
stop.
goes for,
Let's stop
you
here. I
know,
want to
the
go to
country.
Sarah. Sarah has something to say, and John, do you have one final
Yeah, I
thing?
just have one more thing
Okay,
before.
but this is excellent. You are all engaging with these ideas in a way that is authentic, and I'm so proud of you, Stephen, of John, of all of you, and being willing to do this and be open to others. Stephen, you're open to John, you know, and John's listening to Stephen. This is so deeply human what you're doing, and let's give the microphone to Sarah.
Yeah, I just have one last quick thing before Sarah goes. It I think Stephen is right. Like, it definitely does depend on like how they look at it, and what they themselves can like take out of it. A lot of my responses here were personally biased. However, I don't, because of how big this world is and how many people, there would be many people that just they would agree with that. They would want to be more out and authentic. Like, they wouldn't want to be like they wouldn't want to live those quiet lifestyles. So yes, my responses have been pretty personal and biased, but I don't only speak for myself here. I think I speak for a lot of people. Maybe Stephen might think differently, and that's okay, but I definitely speak for myself and many others here.
And he always listens. He always comes to class. He gives us his brain. It's great. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I wanted to say that I think that there's different kinds of suffering. It's not just a single thing, and it's not a dichotomy of like it's either suffering or it's happiness, because you can have something that's bittersweet, right? A thing that there's some suffering, but there's also some joy at the same time. Um, but there's some suffering that we can't avoid, like for instance, aging and sickness and death, right? But we have the capacity as a global society to reduce tremendously the amount of suffering in the world, but we don't. We actively choose not to every day. And that's why we suffer. And I like how Terry Pratchett put it. He's an English satire author who, in his Discworld series, he had someone say, the reason why people are suffering is because of treating people like they're things instead of treating them like people. And I think that's sort of at the root of a lot of the reason why we're not putting in the effort to share resources globally like we should, that we're not making sure that people have access to medical care and things like that. And instead, we're treating other people like things, and that's where we've got wars and things like that. So
As we get into some of the bigger wars in history in the 20th century, the dehumanization of other people that we think are somehow just things, and then we just have no trouble killing them all because they're not really people, they're just things. Very well put. Nico? Microphone for Nico. We're getting close to the end here, folks. Excellent discussion. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to talk about the whole like living in what small town and city thing. I've lived in both.
What's that?
I've lived in both. Like right now, I live
Yeah.
in a ghost town.
Yeah.
But like, if you want to be honest, I think it's a complete personal thing because personally, I like the country style. I like land, like a bunch of land that you have. And since moving to the country, it just feels more free, and that makes me happy. Now, some other people might like big building for like in the city for their like maybe that'll make them happier. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I just think it's a complete personal opinion.
Well, there might be, you're right, but then I would like to sort of bring this back and sort of sum up a little bit to help with the conclusion today, which is there is a reason why the prince chose to go alone into a forest, because he felt that nature had a power, a special power. And so, Nico, your appreciation of land, it's not something to dismiss so easily. There's something there. I think that what we learn from the Buddhist way, to some extent, is that in nature we can derive great strength and power and a sense of beauty. And I will give you a quote that can help you to understand this. Essentially, what I'm trying to say to you is there is a place that we can land here, Nico, that is not, everything, but there's an answer. And nature is an important part of this answer. Rachel Carson, who you will meet in the 20th century, is often considered the mother of the environmental movement, the person who opened us up to the idea that human civilization, through its use of chemicals, through its waste, through the fossil fuels that are emitted, she was writing in the 1960s. She wrote a book called Silent Spring, which is a classic. She basically said something about nature that's very important, and I think I should mention it here. So it can help us to put into context something about what was happening when the prince went into the forest 2,400 years ago, approximately, and why he came up with the answer that he did. Rachel Carson said, you can see this inscribed on a rock or a stone in downtown San Francisco. If you go to San Francisco today, and you will see in one of their main squares, I forget exactly where it was, but there quite a while ago with my wife, hiking in the forest there, the redwood forest. There's a fountain there, and there's a inscription of hers. And it says, those who appreciate the beauty of the earth will find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. Those who appreciate the beauty of the earth will find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. I think that the prince and Ashoka, and even Nico in a small way, maybe doesn't fully realize it, get a great inspiration and strength from being quiet in nature. And when you're quiet in nature, answers come to you. It's called meditation. Now, you don't have to meditate under a tree, but it's important to be quiet and to become still. And when you do that, you start to see things more clearly. It's kind of like in our lives, all day, we're fighting currents. We're in the water and we're being pulled this way and that way by so many different currents, so many things going on. But then at a certain point, You got to go into the riverbank. You got to sit and look out on the river and just sit and wait for the water to get quiet. And then you start to see things clearly. Jacob Bronowski, a world historian I've quoted before and I will again. You met him at the beginning of the course. Do you know what he said the most powerful drive is in the human being? The most powerful force, not sex. I know, probably that must have crossed your mind. Certainly did me when I read this for the first time. Sports. Sports, okay. Stephen may have a different answer, and he may talk about a particular Messiah who arrived and brought hope and love to all of humanity. No. I think this is something you probably never thought of. I'm going to write this on the board for all of you, and then we're going to conclude today's class, because he talked about pleasure. Ooh, I'm going to change this so it's a little thicker. Okay, here we go. Pleasure in your own skill. Yeah. Talk about power. Get good at something. Get really good at that thing. And then we're talking pleasure. If that thing that you're good at is good for other people and not just you, that's profound, because you're improving humanity. So we haven't answered the question yet of what exactly did the prince conclude. I'm going to make that the cliffhanger until next week. I can't resist to, And we're going to pick that up where we leave off today. And I will just go to the cosmos finally and thank Stephen, as always, for your great contributions, and others who are here. We're going to conclude now. Is there anything you would like to add, Andy, Stephen, or anyone else in the cosmos?
Yeah, so you said that the most powerful force in humans is sport.
No, we were joking. We were saying it's not sports, it's not sex. It's what I wrote here, Stephen. I just wrote it.
Pleasure in your own skill.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what Jacob Bronowski said. He was the one I brought to the class in the early part of the semester, who said that he wrote the book Ascent of Man, hosted classic television series on human history, and also he gave us some great lines in terms of the coming of the new mind, how we need to be thinking in a more planetary way. But he said that based on his study of human history, he felt that what makes humans so special and what drives all of us relentlessly is to get better at something. And then we take great pleasure in that. We don't suffer. We take pleasure from that. And that's so important.
I think the most important, I think the most powerful drive in humans is the will to live, because, this whole thing of pleasure in your own skill, yeah, it's a powerful force or whatever, but have you ever heard the saying where it's like, men will do nothing until he has to do something, and then he'll do everything?
Stephen, I want to remind you of Socrates. He decided not to live. So,
Well, I mean, how many sane people are committing suicide, though? That's a statistical anomaly.
Well, we'll leave that to the next class, okay? I always
Socrates didn't have the will to live anymore.
maybe he had a great will, but he realized there was something more important than his life, and he was prepared to give his life for that. In other words,
And he gave up his will to live.
we'll continue to talk about this. Okay, everybody have a great weekend. Tonight, if you're interested at all, I will be hosting an International Women's Day event here with the Rotary clubs and our president. But I don't see any women here. There's no women in the class at all today. But that makes it even more important that the men hear this. Well, okay, sorry, Sarah. Okay, but I mean, if you want to come tonight, you're welcome to it. Okay, yeah. My apologies. Okay, yeah. I still have a lot of growing to do too. Okay, yeah. So, does anyone have anything they'd like to say before we conclude? Have a great weekend. Enjoy the warm weather that's not caused by God but humans. See you next week. Okay. All right, I got to save something before I forget here. So I'll do it this way. Which is what? Oh yeah, I want to save chat for Stevens. Where's the chat? That's strange. Huh. Doesn't want to save it. Okay, I'll go and fix that. I'll fix that momentarily. Yep. Okay. Okay, come on in. I just need to. Art? Sure.